So hello and welcome everyone to this, our summer Tuesday spotlight, an evening one for a change, just to change up the schedule. We're delighted to have you all with us if you're here live in the Zoom room or if you're catching up via YouTube with the recording. It's a delight to have you with us. And this is going to be a great topic today, talking all about the future of Egyptology. So I'm delighted to introduce our speaker, Monica Hanna. Dr. Monica Hanna is an associate professor and the acting dean of the College of Archaeology and Cultural Heritage, Arab Academy for Science and Technology and Maritime Transport in Aswan, Egypt. Here she has founded a program specialized in archaeology and cultural heritage. Hanna established Egypt's Heritage Task Force to raise awareness about protecting archaeological sites in Egypt, especially after the 2011 revolution. Her current research focuses on decolonizing archaeology, repatriation and restitution amongst methods for accessibility for the wider public to archaeology and heritage, with a particular interest in digital humanities. And so today we're going to be exploring some of those topics by discussing the need to critically reassess Egyptology through decolonization, broader focus, and ethical and sustainable practices. There we go. And of course, this is going to be based on Monica's first monograph, which I'm lucky to have a copy of right here, and entitled the same as today's event, The Future of Egyptology, which is discussing some of those topics through three different sections. The first, thinking about the difficult heritage of Egyptology, moving on to the present day, and also thinking about the future. And of course, you don't need to hear more from me. We're delighted to hear from the author herself. Delighted to pass over the digital screen to you, Monica Hanna. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. I'm very happy for this wonderful invitation and happy to be here. I will today try to speak about different ideas about the book that I've written. I've structured the presentation a little bit different from the book so that I do not repeat myself quite often. And I've also included other research that I've been doing to try to enrich the conversation so that it's different from reading the book. I like this art very much by the Luxor artist, Ali Awad, where I always look at how art actually is part of the future of Egyptology. So I want us to think about that in different terms. So let's start with this, one of my favorite slides about the future of Egyptology. So what does Egyptology actually do? And I like how it makes fun of what my mom thinks we do, what my friends think we do, what History Channel think we do. And then what we really do is basically a lot of teaching and archival research as well. So also looking at the spectacularization, what Hollywood thinks we do and what we think we do, how do we envision Egyptology? So maybe it's also some food for thought to reflect on our practice. I want us to think about this photo a little bit, to take a minute to think of all those who have been written out of the historical record. This is an image of the workmen who discovered the tomb of Tutankhamun. We don't know their names. We know that they've carried a lot of dirt, and you see many of them were still children. So I want us to think of the history of Egyptology as a very selective history. And that's why I start the book with the idea of a critical history of Egyptology. It's the history of all those unknown people that we've left out from the history of the great excavations and the great discoveries as that of Tutankhamun. And in a way, I attempt to restore this by perhaps trying to deconstruct the field, by trying to bring today's grandchildren into the history, which is also part of the book cover about bringing back Egyptians in the study of Egyptology. But that's not the purpose of what I write. It's just one aspect. And I want us to remember all those who shoveled and all those who carried dirt to make such great discoveries. So recently, I did not invent the wheel. Were many Egyptologists who actually wrote about why Egyptology has become stagnant. What is the problem of Egyptology? Why is it not evolving? Why is it lagging behind archaeology? Why is it still an area study and not part of the humanities and social science? So we see also I think one of the best written articles by Juan Carlos Moreno, who writes and says the cursed discipline. How Egyptology is still, in a way, I see it, it's still in a glass box in the museum. How Egyptology is unable to evolve and unable to develop. And my first degree was Egyptology. I have a BAA from the American University in Cairo in Egyptology. So I've always been self-reflective from what I taught, from what I learned in class, and from what I learned on excavations. So I did not wake up one day and realize that Egyptology is unwell. Actually, this is a realization that you come to understand. It's like opening your eyes in the sunlight suddenly and little by bit learning how to see things differently. The taints of racism, the taints of the problems of the discipline itself, and um, its difficult heritage, as I described it. So, of course, this did not just come in a vacuum. There has been a very strong movement of decolonization. And of course, decolonization means different things to different people. Some people think decolonization is bringing Egyptians on excavation. Some people think decolonization is um, writing in Arabic or making Egyptology accessible in Arabic. Some people think that decolonization is writing the historical narrative differently. So it actually means different things to different people. But I think the real decolonization that is quite challenging is actually decolonizing the post-colonizers, where the current institutions of governance of heritage are also replicating the colonizing ideas. So how can we actually decolonize the people who think that they are decolonized? So I think this has been the true challenge. And of course, as Edward Said had explained, that the project Orientalism started with Napoleon's campaign on Egypt, where he thought of himself as the grandson of Alexander the Great and wanted to come to Egypt. You know, he said, I wanted to go to Egypt on an elephant, holding a Quran in my hand and inventing a new religion. You know, he had these Orientalist fantasies, wanting to be the new Alexander the Great. Of course, Napoleon, to fund his expedition on Egypt, he goes and loots antiquities in Italy. So it starts actually with antiquities looting from the beginning to fund for his excavation to Egypt. He comes to Egypt, and we know that he reaches Alexandria at 6 in the morning. We read that in their accounts. And of course, Alexandria by then was just around 20,000 inhabitants. We know from even the records how the Alexandrians fought very hardly, the French, to defend their city. And I like this stencil, the cartoon, very much because it shows how the French thought of us, the Egyptians. You can see how they thought that they were bringing European enlightenment, they were bringing science, and they even had Monsieur Comte, who had the Montgolfière to amaze and bedazzle the Egyptians. And of course, they came with all their measurement tools, while we Egyptians here, we are the enemies of science. We are trying to kill the enlightenment they try to bring from Europe. Of course, the French military came with 167 savants who wanted to study Egypt, beside, of course, the military. So it was this military campaign who also included these scientists, or science under the disguise of military, or the other way around. It was military trying also to disguise behind bringing enlightenment. So I really like this because it shows how contested heritage is, and it all occurs on the Pompey's Pillar. So I like this cartoon very much because it shows a lot of this push and pull between colonization, enlightenment, studying, the heritage, and the resistance. I think it is very relevant to today in the dynamics of Egyptology that it is still very and highly contested. Of course, the French campaign. First thing they find in Alexandria is this sarcophagus currently taken by the British forces. So it's in the British Museum. It was then, of course, the French campaign thought that this is the sarcophagus of Alexander the Great. Of course, it was used as part of the ablution fountain in the Mosque of Al-Attarin, which is something, a very common practice, because heritage has always been alive by reusing it. So temples were made into churches, blocks were reused into construction, then later mosques. So this has been the practice or the de jure praxis of recycling heritage. So the French campaign immediately think they found the tomb of Alexander the Great. Of course, later when the Champollion translated ancient Egyptian, we found out that this belonged to Nectanebo of the 30th dynasty. But it is now, of course, part of the British taken as loot. Then the French campaign moves from Alexandria. You can see the route here all the way to Cairo. We know that they pass via Damanhur. They kill many Egyptians on their way, and we know from one of the accounts of the soldiers that at some point they say that the river Nile was full of corpses of Egyptians, that even some of the soldiers in the French campaign committed suicide. The carnage was so difficult that the soldiers could not take it. So this idea that the French campaign only created the description de l'Egypte is in a way washing the crimes or washing the blood of the Egyptians who were killed for Napoleon's Orientalist fantasies. Then, of course, Napoleon goes to Cairo. He claims that he created this fantastic victory, and he actually asks this painting to be drawn. And I find this painting very telling about how the West, because you can see here, there is Napoleon all very nicely dressed in his very fashionable uniform, looking very nice, while the poor Egyptians are bare feet and they're hiding behind their women, which is, I think, something that I came to look and see later of how actually the West sexualizes the East as this woman. And I found it to be very telling that how they wanted to show that the men of the Egyptians, of course, they were Egyptian soldiers and some Mamluks who did not have a regular army, were hiding behind the women. So this idea of bringing the woman in the war scene is part of this sexualization. Of course, the Egyptians revolt, and we know of the Battle of the Pyramids and the Battle of Imbaba. But then Nelson, the British commander, was very worried that Napoleon would cut the road to India. So he comes and destroys the whole French fleet in the famous Battle of Aboukir, and the French lose the war to the British. At this time, there is the Cairo revolt. Napoleon deserts the army. Then General Kleber comes. The French go into Al-Azhar and tramples Al-Azhar with their horses, which the clerics, of course, dislike very much. And by the way, the French did not just take objects of ancient Egypt. They also stole thousands of manuscripts of Islamic manuscripts from Al-Azhar, now at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. Of course, we know about how the French killed many Egyptians at the Battle of Imbaba. And we hear of Sulayman al-Halabi, who stabs General Kleber, who was left to command the army in the place of Napoleon. And one of the very telling things that I find in what happened is that the French took away the body of Sulayman al-Halabi and the dagger. So they did not just take antiquities, ancient Egyptian, Islamic manuscripts, but they also took away the agency of people to create memory, a memory of even their very small victory over their colonizers. So they took away the body of Suleiman al-Halabi and the dagger. And I think the body is kept at one of the natural science museums in Paris at the moment. Of course, the French savants continued their activities. They went around measuring the pyramids, the Sphinx, describing and writing. The Institut d'Egypte was created. And of course, at that time, Napoleon knew that what happened was a very strong military defeat. So the only way to flip such a military defeat is to show that it's a cultural victory. Cultural victory, also quoting Edward Said, over the other. And at this moment, it happened that we Egyptians became the other, as well as ancient Egypt. Here we also see the city of Rosetta, where the famous Rosetta stone was found while they were digging a trench. Then it was sent to the Institut d'Egypte. Also, we know about the copies of the Zodiac of Dendera. But of course, this idea of flipping the military defeat into a cultural victory did not pass by the Italians, who knew that Napoleon was playing this game. They knew very well that he had lost the war. Of course, the Italians did not, although I mean, Napoleon was also at that time partly Italian, but still they understood that this was the game being played. So they made this very funny cartoon of Napoleon being mummified in a sarcophagus and just made fun of him, of how he lost the war, so he was trying to show that it's a cultural victory. We know here from this is the scene of the Battle of Abu Ir, and when Nelson came to fight the French in Egypt, he did not come alone. He created a combined army with the Ottomans. Egypt at that time was still part of the Ottoman Empire, and Nelson came by the sea and the Ottomans came by land. And you can see here, there were no Egyptians part of the capitulation of Alexandria. So Article 16 here said that the members of the French Institute can take all the small objects, also including the manuscripts from Al-Azhar that they stole, but the objects, the bigger objects, which are 17 objects, should be given, including the Rosetta Stone, should be given to the combined army. Who is the combined army? It's the British and the Ottomans. As far as I know, the Ottomans never ceded the right in the 17 objects that were taken as a spoil of war. So this leaves actually the objects that are today at the British Museum of the Rosetta and the 16 other objects in a very contested situation, because Egypt was part of the Ottoman Empire. The combined army had the Ottomans and the British. So the Ottomans should have taken a share of the 17 objects, which they did not. They did not cede the right in part of the combined. So even legally, I mean, if we just go for the legal argument, the 17 objects taken as a spoil of war from Egypt today are highly contested because they are not property only of the British army. Of course, as part of the Ottoman army that came was the famous Mehmed Ali. Mehmed Ali did not know how to read and write, but he was very shrewd. He was very smart. He was part of the mercenaries who came to fight with the combined army with the British. He seizes power. Of course, there was then, after the French leave Egypt, there is a power vacuum. He seizes power and starts his dynasty until 1952. Mehmet Ali did not care that much about antiquities. He just used it. He knew that Drovetti and Henry Salt and Datanazi, the famous European consuls of the early 18th century, wanted antiquities, because after the French campaign, everybody wanted Egyptian antiquities to fill their museums. So they basically were antiquities traders, and in exchange, Mehmet Ali asked them to buy weapons for him, as well as European support against the Ottoman Sultan. So Mehmet Ali, it was much, much later that I believe in 1936, that the first decree on protecting antiquities. But up until then, Mehmet Ali was using antiquities as just a commodity to lure in these consuls to give him support. And we even find that the archive in the unit of the Sublime Porte letters from Fermans, actually, from Mehmet Ali with his Tughra, telling the customs in Alexandria that Henry Salt has the right to ship all the antiquities that he wants. And he would also write the different governors in the different areas of Egypt to help Henry Salt find antiquities and sell them. So, but of course, later Mehmet Ali changes the position with pressure from Egyptians to issue a decree to protect, relatively, of course, the antiquities. We read here one of the very interesting quotations by Captain E. de Verninac Saint-Mur, and it's from the book of Whose Pharaohs by Donald Malcolm Reed. He says, France, snatching an obelisk from the ever-heightening mud of the Nile or the savage ignorance of the Turks, earns the right to the thanks of the learned of Europe, to whom belong all the monuments of antiquity, because they alone know how to appreciate them. Antiquity is a garden that belongs by natural right to those who cultivate and harvest its fruits. So you could see how Europe was fashioning itself in this. They are the natural heirs of Egyptian antiquity as part of, because they can appreciate it and they can know its value. A little bit after Mehmet Ali and his time, we know that by the time of Khedive Abbas Helmi I was a little bit eccentric and weird, and he liked eating pasta. That Mariette Pasha came, he, I believe, had 6,000 francs from the Louvre to buy Coptic manuscripts. Thankfully, the Coptic Pope, Pope Peter the Gauli, or Baba Boutros el Gauli, asked that all monasteries would send the manuscripts to the library in Izbakeya to protect them. So he could not buy Coptic manuscripts for the Louvre. Instead, he went around in Saqqara to dig and excavate without a firman. So before, at that time of Mehmet Ali, no one was allowed to excavate unless they had a firman from the ruler or the viceroy. So Mariette did not have a permit. So he would go and dig in Saqqara, and he actually excavated the whole Serapeum without a firman, which led Khedive Abbas Helmi I to send soldiers to Saqqara to stop Mariette many times, that Mariette had to hide the loot on the objects he found from the excavations on site, pretty much like how modern looters are still doing, where they hide a lot of their loot on the archaeological sites. And you could see that after that, these are documents that we find in something called Mahafiz al-Abhath, or the research mahfazas at the archive, how the French consulate in Alexandria was writing letters to excuse Mariette from his theft. They were writing letters to the viceroy, telling him that Monsieur Mariette is not a thief as you think. He's a researcher, he's a museum curator. He's not a thief like the others. So you could see the gravity of what he did. And I believe all the objects now that are in the Louvre from the Serapeum should be restituted because they were excavated, looted, and sent without a firman. And of course, you can see here how they were trying to get him back to games and interceding. Of course, this was with Said after Abbas Helmi I died. Of course, we know then about the Madrasat al-Lisan al-Qadim, or the first Egyptian Egyptology school, which was by Heinrich Brugsch under Khedive Ismail, where they started with teaching 6 Egyptians at an alley very close to Boulay. I've tried to look for it. I've tried to find the modern address, but I could not. I think the streets have completely changed. Out of the 6 students, Ahmed Kamal Pasha, who tries to go and work at the Boulay Museum, but Mariette would send him away many times because Mariette was afraid that if Egyptians would learn ancient Egyptian, he will run out of his job. They will take his place, and they would know the value of the work. So he would actually forbid Egyptians from going to learn at the museum. And you see here, this is also in 1912, when Egypt started to have the first law for antiquities after the 1891 decree of Khedive Tawfiq, that people such as the Royal Asiatic Society, the British Science Association would actually write letters against the law. Some of the letters said that the Egyptian antiquities are not as pretty as the classical antiquities, so no one will want to excavate them and buy them, and that many Egyptian fellahin and peasants will not find livelihoods if we do not come and excavate. So this was part of even the correspondence for the first law. Of course, this is my great team. All of them have graduated now. We work together at the archive. I know how difficult it is to gain access. I'm still struggling also to renew our access, but the National Archive of Egypt is a true treasure for anyone who wants to study Egyptian Egyptology as well as international Egyptology, because a lot of the letters have never been published. This is also one of the very interesting letters that I found at the archive by Ahmed Kamal Pasha after him spending several years working at the Ministry of Antiquities. He comes to a point where there is a free position, and he's trying to take this position, to contest that they want to bring a foreigner, a Frenchman, in his place. This letter was written to the Egyptian Prime Minister in October 28, 1894. So Ahmed Kamal Pasha writes it actually in 3 languages, English, French, and Arabic. We find the 3 letters at the archival unit of the public works, or نظارة الأشغال العامة. So let me read what Ahmed Kamal Pasha wrote. He says, firstly, when he tries to contest why they're not giving him the position, he says, firstly, I'm more senior than him. Him here is a French person they're trying to bring for the management position. So firstly, I'm more senior than him because I have been in service for 21 years while he has been in service for 6. We are at the same administrative level, and our academic knowledge is the same. In addition to me exceeding him because I know Arabic. Secondly, he does not have a degree that I lack. Thirdly, his father is an antiquities dealer in France, and for that specific reason, it's absolutely wrong to appoint him as a deputy director. Fourthly, the museum is a national museum, and Egypt is deprived of knowing its own science of antiquities. So you could see how the sentiment of the first Egyptian Egyptologist was in 1894, and how unfair and unjust the antiquity service was to the people that they should have been serving their heritage. And we have read that. And I think that comes to a very fundamental issue of Egyptology. Egyptology starts with Henry Salt and Drovetti selling antiquities, creating museum collections, looking for the treasure, for the gold, for the secrets. And I like to use this Disney picture of Uncle Scrooge hiding the gold from everyone. We know how Uncle Scrooge collects gold for his own self-enjoyment. And I think that how museums have created their collections, especially of ancient Egypt. Although the idea of the museum started in Iraq many, many years ago, we had the museum in Alexandria. Cabinets of curiosity of the Victorian era propagated this idea of cultural power, that if you travel and buy the heritage and the art of the other, you gain prestige. And I think museum mimicked this idea of cultural power, that if you buy objects, if you have the Rosetta Stone part of your collection, you gain this prestige, this cultural power that gives you a definition of yourself and the other. And here, this is also one of the interesting stencils of the French campaign. We see how the French campaign went stealing Italian art to fund their mission on Egypt. So this idea of colonialism, antiquarianism, and this focus on the object, I think is everything that's wrong with Egyptology, that it did not start as an anthropological science to understand how modern and ancient Egypt relate to each other and how to study it as a culture, but rather to sort out its treasure. Then, of course, came later studying the art and the religion and so on. But I think this focus on the treasure has ruined Egyptology, and today we still suffer from the ramifications of how it started the campaign. You can see this very clearly because everybody probably from our audience today knows this sarcophagus of the priest Nedjaman, which was repatriated to Egypt from the Metropolitan Museum a few years ago. I was part of the investigation team. And the reason we found out about the sarcophagus is Kim Kardashian took a photo in front of the sarcophagus at the Met. And we had seen videos of someone trying to sell it. So museums are still buying gold items because they look interesting, they look fashionable, and are still continuing what has started by Napoleon. I see how the black market functions today is very similar to how it functioned 200 years ago, of wanting to buy objects because these objects bring prestige to the museum. It brings this cultural power over the other, regardless, of course, of the ethics and the studying and all this. This is a different thing. But it's this focus on the materiality of the ancient Egyptian past that has crippled the discipline and made and reduced it into this area study where we all feel it is not engaging with the humanities and social sciences as it should. And of course, not just also ancient Egypt, because you know the Museum of the Bible forgot the most famous commandment of the of the Testament that said, "Do not steal." And of course, they bought thousands of stolen objects from the market. And if you have not seen the recent book of Professor Roberta Mazza of Stolen Fragments, it's a must-read by everyone. And of course, there is the recycling of the loot in this idea of we save those antiquities. And as if there is a noble mission for these museums behind the loot and the theft, and the cultural power is that they've saved them. Because, of course, we savage populations do not appreciate antiquity, pretty much as what Ferdinand de Moor said, that antiquity is only for the West who can appreciate it. And the same continues because there was this Joan Howard, who was the wife of a diplomat in Egypt, who went on TV a few years ago and said that she went with antiquities dealer to dig for treasures. And she was very proud of it. She was the wife of an Australian ambassador in Egypt. After even before that, the law never allowed individuals to dig and excavate for objects. I mean, everybody had firmans or official permits, but she did that. She had the audacity to replicate what uh, Henry Salt and Drovetti and the Tanazi were doing, this cultural imperialism and this feel that she can do this because it's fun, it's about the treasure hunt, it's about the objects. And of course, this remains a lot. This is, of course, currently shifting. In 2018, we know that Benedict Savoy and Felwinsar created this report after Emmanuel Macron announced in Ouagadougou that France and Europe will be restituting many objects. But of course, the report focused mostly on African objects and sub-Saharan objects. And in a way, many of the museums, of course, ignored Egypt. Egypt is not Africa. And of course, this was also adding again to the whitewashed narrative of ancient Egypt, that ancient Egypt is part of Europe. It's not Africa. Why should we restitute it? This is just for the African objects, and Egypt is not and should not be part of this. And of course, we try to challenge this many of the times. And one of the famous challenges that we're trying to do is working through the bust of Nefertiti, because I think the bust of Nefertiti shows a lot of everything that is wrong with Egyptology. And this is hopefully my next book that's coming. So Egyptology in the 20th century was also marked by racism. We know the great ideas of Flinders Petrie. Of course, we consider him the father of Egyptology, but he had some serious racist ideas about communities in Egypt and the communities in the Middle East. And we know, of course, of the struggles of Selim Hassan. And despite the nationalists in Egypt calling for installing Selim Hassan as the head of the Antiquity Service in many, many, many newspapers, King Fouad and King Farouk refused, and they insisted that a Frenchman should keep the direction of the service. So let's go back to the time when Nefertiti left Egypt. Egypt was under Khedive Abbas Helmi II, who was a very nice man, probably, I mean, not as difficult as Abbas Helmi I, who people thought he was really very difficult to deal with, and under Lord Cromer. So Egypt was under this layered colonialism. There was the British, there was the Mehmed Ali family that was part and not part of the Ottoman Empire. So, and the Antiquity Service was under the French. And at that time, one of the French news reporters wrote in one of the French newspapers that if Egypt is now lost, that Egypt is no longer French, ancient Egypt will continue and remain French. So there was this idea of the monopoly of ancient Egypt by the French. And of course, when Lord Cromer came, he tried to, of course, to push Maspero, to kick some French out and put some British in. He tries to bring people like Howard Carter and other people to make the Egyptology committee also not 100% French, but also with some British influence in it. He tried to bring, at that time, the head of the Antiquity Service was Gaston Maspero, and Howard Carter, who we know that his first part of the committee, and he gets kicked out because he has an incident with some French tourists in Saqqara who came drunk. So Howard Carter asks the Ghafirs to go and shoot them because they were destroying some of the tombs. Of course, this causes a political problem, and they expel Howard Carter from the Antiquity Service at that time. The first time we read about Borchardt was, or Borchardt as the Germans call him, was in 20th of March 1905. We know that the Egyptology Committee, this is a copy from the note that we found at the archive, also at the Ashghal, or the Ministry of Public Works unit, where it discusses that on the 20th of March, Borchardt gets hired as part of the Egyptology committee with Baron Dobsing. And so he then becomes a person who is responsible for protecting Egyptian antiquities in 1905. His background was in architecture. He had worked for the German consulate, I believe, earlier. And then he starts excavating in Egypt in different places. He gets hired later by James Simon, who was a rich cotton trader wanting to create antiquities collection, Oriental antiquities collection in Berlin. He's the founder of the Deutsche Orientalische Gesellschaft. And he hires Borchardt to excavate objects for him. He excavates in many places, and of course, he excavates in Tell el Amarna. We know that by 1891, after the Khedive Tawfiq, this is how the excavation contract looked like, or as they called it in Arabic, Contrato el-Hafr. Articles 4 and 5 clearly stated that Egypt owned all antiquities. And it was the Egyptian right to cede some of these antiquities to the excavator in exchange of the money he spent. But if Egypt wanted any objects from the second partage or from the half that would be taken by the excavator, Egypt had the right to buy them with money that's not more than what the excavator has paid. So this was very clear. I'm still looking for the contract of Borchardt at the archive because the Germans say that they do not have a contract. I'll try to look at the DOG, but I'm also looking at the National Archive once I get the permit. We know, I believe, in December 6th or 9th, the bust of Nefertiti is discovered in the workshop of Tutmosis. And we know that Borchardt writes James Simon and tells him that, oh, she's so beautiful. She's really wonderful. You have to see it yourself. And this is one of the photos taken by some of the tourists who visited the site very close to the discovery. This is the place today of the workshop of Tutmosis where the bust was taken from in Tel El Amar. The bust leaves Egypt, then First World War happens. It remains at the house of James Simon in Germany. And we know that many important dignitaries also go and see it in that house. Meanwhile, in Egypt, after World War I, there is the 1919 revolutions. Egyptians go out to street, and particularly women, of course, with the general cliches of long live the cross with the crescent. And this changes the way Egyptians view everything. It changes also the way they view heritage. They view their past and the way they want to see their heritage managed. 1922, the tomb of Tutankhamun is discovered. Howard Carter, of course, is tone deaf to the social changes that happened in Egypt. So, of course, he picks fight, and there was this drama of the Times newspaper being the only reporter, which gets stopped. And many times they stop his work, and then too much drama with Howard Carter and the Ministry of Antiquities. At that time, in the Egyptian parliament, two people managed to stop that the partage of Tutankhamun happens, which were Mor'us Hanna Besha, and were not related. He's Mor'us Hanna Besha from Al-Mansura, and Saad Zaghlul. And they manage, according to the contract created by Khedive Tawfiq in 1891, to stop the partage by actually buying all the second half that should have been part of the partage. But not only the second half, they paid the heirs of Lord Carnarvon all the money they spent on excavation. And that money at that time was 34,791 pounds paid in full to the heirs of Lord Carnarvon. And I've also found in the archive the ministry line for creating this budget to save the collection of Tutankhamun. Of course, despite the collection left, we've just seen recently that there was some objects still stolen by Howard Carter himself. We know also that the archive of the excavation goes to the Griffith Institute. So yes, we have managed to save the objects, but the agency to create knowledge about this tomb was still taken to the UK. In 1912, I've read this book by Benedict Savoy called Nefertiti, a German-French affair. And she worked on the archive of Pierre Lacau, who was the director of the Antiquity Service after Gaston Maspero. And she pretended that it was all just a rivalry between the British and an imperial rivalry between the British and the French, where they decided to put the French and the Germans, where the Germans decided to put the bust of Nefertiti on display. They have taken the full collection from James Simon, who fled Germany for fear of anti-Semitic views. He fled to Switzerland. So he gave the full Amarna collection to the Berlin Museum, who kept Nefertiti hidden until the discovery of Tutankhamun. They were very jealous of the British. They thought that the British Museum is going to get many of the objects and put them on display, so they put Nefertiti on display. I was very shocked. I thought, I mean, how come the Egyptians were never part of this? How was it a German-French affair? These were the documents by Benedict Savoy in her book. So I took my team and we went to the National Egyptian Archive. We spent several months looking at different areas. Then on the database, it's not really a database, it's an index, a digital index. I've managed to find a unit at the Khargeya, or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, called Al-Mahad Al-Almani Al-Athar, or the German Archaeological Institute. And this is the number 12311. And to access that, you need a special permit from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So I waited another 3 months to receive the permit. Once the permit arrived, I've asked immediately for this file, and I spent a few minutes unable to open the file. I was like wondering what could be there in that file. Then I opened the file. I found around 500 documents from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs on the negotiation of the bust of Nefertiti. So news to Benedict Savoy and everybody before, it's not a German-French affair. The different Egyptian ministries were very, very involved in the restitution and the repatriation of the bust, and not just during King Fuad, but also in the 1940s as well. Many correspondence between Hassan Nashat Besha, who was the Egyptian ambassador at the Royal Legation of Egypt in Berlin, clippings from a newspaper. And it's very funny that this article that was written, Al-Ahram, in 1828 was criticized very much by Borchardt, and he threatened to sue the Ahram because they wrote that Borchardt, of course, stole the bust of Nefertiti. Egypt at that time was very afraid of the German government, so they preferred that the first negotiations would actually be between Pierre Lacau from Egypt, representing Egypt, a Frenchman representing Egypt, and Heinrich Schaefer, the director of the Berlin Museum in Germany. These negotiations go. Egypt tries to propose that Egypt will give 2 statues from the Cairo Museum in exchange of the bust of Nefertiti. The letters go back and forth endlessly. I mean, we have so much correspondence, and even Monsieur Lacau goes and meets Heinrich Schaefer in Berlin. They spend time, and Hassan Nashat Besha would be there to write the notes. And then one of the things they actually write here about that, okay, we need to reach James Simon to see what he thinks about restituting the bust of Nefertiti. And of course, they knew that the bust, that James Simon had already fled Germany. And we also see here that they write, we're very afraid of the German public opinion, because if we restitute her, the people will be very upset. One of the things that I have yet to verify, said by an Israeli historian called Ruth Isken, saying that Simon donated Nefertiti, wrote in the donation request to the museum that if Egypt would ask the bust back, the museum should restitute it. I have only found this reference in her book, but I cannot still find the archival document. So I say this, but I'm not 100 sure that this document exists, but I'm just citing her book at the moment while I look for the original document of James Simon. We see also how the Egyptians managed to convince the Prussian government to give back the bust. And at that time, they were still negotiating. The negotiations would stop because King Fuad goes to Berlin. And we have this very funny cartoon that was used by Donald Malcolm Reed as a book cover, where they make fun and they call him Liebe Fuadchen or Little Fuad. Do you want to take Nefertiti to become part of your harem? Again, sexualizing women from ancient Egypt and looking at women and this idea of the harem and very highly, and we'll get back in the talk to this point. Of course, King Fuad, I mean, he got back to Egypt and they say that he never brought up Nefertiti with Hitler. Probably everyone was afraid from Hitler. We know that first the negotiations between Pierre Lacour and Heinrich Schaeffer fail, but then Egypt under Hassan Nashat Pasha manages to convince the Prussian government to restitute the bust of Nefertiti. And we do find a phone call in Abdin, Diwan Abdin, which is another archival unit, where it's a phone call between Hassan Nashat Pasha in Berlin and King Fuad telling him that they will restitute Nefertiti, then 3 hours, that the Prussian government agrees to restitute Nefertiti, then 3 hours after that, Hassan Nashat calls King Fuad and tells him that Hitler had vetoed, or the Third Reich had vetoed sending back Nefertiti. Of course, some people say because Hitler said that he was so much in love with her. This is here the phone call, the notes or the verbal of the phone call between King Fuad and Hassan Nashat Pasha telling him that the Prussian government had finally agreed to restitute the bust. But I did not just work in the National Archive of Egypt. I went to Kew in London. And why London? Because no one has looked there. And because I found also hundreds of letters about the bust of Nefertiti in London. And most of them were intelligence reports shared by the British ambassador in Berlin with the chief curator of the Egyptian department. And you can read here with me one of the letters saying that at all costs, the negotiations must fail because if it succeeds and it will constitute a most undesirable precedent for claim for Egypt and Greece for the return of the articles in our museums. The Rosetta Stone and the Elgin marbles are in danger. So Egypt was not just negotiating with the Berlin Museum. Egypt was negotiating with this idea of colonial powers who want to keep their collections, pretty much as Uncle Scrooge wanted to keep the gold in his safe. Then, after World War II, the bust is found in Wiesbaden in Germany under the American part. And at that time, Mahmoud Basha Fahmi Nuqrashi, Minister of Foreign Affairs and later Prime Minister, writes letters to the quadripartite army asking for the bust. So Egypt never forgot, never gave up on Nefertiti with Hitler. They write the four powers. Only the Soviet Union responds saying, of course, Egypt should get back the bust of Nefertiti. They write the British and the French, who say, it's the Americans have to decide. We do not have to decide. These are the drafts of the letters he actually wrote. He wrote in English, Arabic, and French. This is also these notes I find in the Nara archive in Washington. So we find copies of the letter at the Egyptian archive, at Kew, and at Nara in Washington. This is the famous Mahmoud Pasha Fahmi Nuqrashi, who was later murdered by the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. And you can see here his very pretty signature in Arabic. And I would like to read part of the letter that he writes, because I believe it's very telling about the nature of Egyptology. Let me translate or attempt to translate. He says, Hitler is no longer there, and his will is no longer law. And so there is nothing that could stop putting this loot built on forgery and مستند إلى القوة and standing to power where Nefertiti, should be returned as it's part of the ancient Egyptian artifacts who should have never left Egypt. So that she's put back in the right place in the Cairo Museum. So scientists can study her and other of her collection that this time has produced. And then he finishes his quoting by saying that by restituting Nefertiti is bringing back, is doing the right thing, which should be appreciated by everyone quite a lot. And Egypt and the public opinion in different countries would also appreciate. Unfortunately, the Americans go back and forth and they don't know what to do. So they send the report to the famous monument men. And we know here from Lamont Moore, who was the director, I think he was the one Ben Affleck acted in the film of Monuments Men, where he writes very clearly that the bust was not smuggled, and we cannot return it back because returning it back is just appeasing the Egyptians. And to return this, I'm quoting him, he says, to return this item to Egypt would be to follow the Nazi principle of confiscating works of art by presence or force in order to enlarge their own collection. So it's very funny how twisted the logic was made. And here, from a personal point of view, I should like to follow your recommendation that we consider no immediate action, yet I feel that if the Egyptian authorities succeed in their plan, we might be faced with similar problems which might not be easily solved once the Nefertiti precedent has been established. So there was this fear of the Nefertiti precedent. And it's very funny that even, I mean, how we hail the monuments men who saved the antiquities from the hands of Hitler, they themselves looked at the bust very differently. And of course, we also see the Metropolitan Museum also proposed that they can have the bust of Nefertiti instead of it's going back to Germany. They officially refuse, citing that there has to be a German government to make these decisions. We Americans cannot do it. And I like this graffiti by also the Luxor artist Ammar Abu Bakr, who he drew it in 1912 in Frankfurt, and he used the 100 € note and wrote 100 years of theft. But did the monuments men only treat Egyptians like that, or was it for everyone? This is the famous statue of the Discobolo that Mussolini sold to Hitler. So he basically took money. He sold it to Hitler. When the Italians, who were also part of the Axis, requested this statue from the monuments men, they restituted the statue, although it was sold by Mussolini and was not contested like the bust of Nefertiti. So there was this idea of some rights are more equal than others. The rights of the Italians, because they are part of the enlightened West, were definitely more equal than the requests of the Egyptians. And you see this is also propagated by Hermann Partzinger, the president of the Cultural Heritage Foundation in Germany, who would go and say, I mean, why would the Egyptians want Nefertiti back? Nefertiti is part of Germany now, and that the Egyptians have nothing to do with ancient Egypt. The modern Egyptians are, he said that, either Muslim or Christian. They are not ancient Egyptians. And it's very funny because I don't see any people in Berlin praying for Amun or the Aten. It's just very weird that the way he thinks that. But I think that has to do a lot with how flawed Egyptology has been, where it focused only on the materiality without looking at cultural continuation. And this idea of the discontinuity pretext is that ancient Egypt is dead. So ancient Egypt had to die so we can become the heirs, so the Western museums can become the heirs for the objects of this dead culture. And this, I think, deprived Egyptology from being this live science, social science and humanity, where people can look at modern Egypt differently. And you can see how iconography continued. Of course, the famous Isis Lactans and Virgin Mary and Sayyidah Zainab, the cult of the mother goddess, and the idea of the sycamore tree, that, of course, this is Isis, the mother of Tutmosis III, but as well as this idea of the oracle trees, where the ancient Egyptians would go sleep under it and dream of the miracles or what troubles them, is something that has still continued in modern Egypt with the ideas of Al-Khidr. The mourning processions, the way Egyptians relate to their cult of the dead, how there is even the lamentations that women say in the funerals, bringing rahma wa nur, which is the cakes that the Egyptians make to go visit their dead, is the same words in ancient Egyptian. How also this idea of a holy place continued. The Luxor temple being a temple for Amun, then being a church, then being a mosque, and the Sufist ideas of using the boat in their celebrations, it's not different from how the Egyptians used bark shrines. Although you can tell that there were 700 or 800 years of difference from using that. Probably no one in in the Mulid of Abu al-Haggag in Luxor saw a festival for Amun. But there was this continuity that people had in their heritage and in their life, and also the processions for the saints. Here is St. George, and here this is the Sufis. This idea also of the procession of the dead and magic. And you can even see modern spells and ancient spells and this obsession of magic in rural life in Egypt. I mean, very few Egyptologists actually look at that. And I think this is so much lost knowledge that could have enlightened us and would have not felt that ancient Egypt was so fast. And of course, there is this continuous claim that, yeah, but the Egyptians are not interested in their past. And you can see here a photo from the 50s where women would go to the Cairo Museum. And of course, many very well-educated people would say, they go to the museum to have children. Yes, but what's wrong with that? In a way, they engage with the past in their own way. And I'm sure they've also have their own curiosities. And many women did not just go for fertility rituals, but they went because they really wanted to know. And they felt this connection. And I like here this photo in the mummy parade where women were actually greeting, although I mean they were empty carts, but still there was this feeling of pride and feeling that these are our ancestors. And this is the National Museum of Civilizations. A few days after it had opened, it was only full of Egyptians. It was during COVID. We had no tourists in Egypt, and you could see how Egyptians were very happy to see the new exhibition that explained to them. Of course, most museum professionals would speak about the freedom of movement, but is there really a freedom of movement of the heritage? And this was part of the other photo is part of the experiment where we took a bust of Nefertiti, a 3D print, into the village of Tel El Amarna. And I think there was this very interesting thing that we always feel that the museum curators are the only ones who can touch the past. But in a way, also digital heritage can give us this accessibility where this sanctity of these objects can actually be touched and hugged and played with. I would always take my students to remember where Nefertiti was taken from. So it's just not me, but it's also generational, where there is this new memory of what has been taken from us. But I think Nefertiti, the bust, is not just about an object that had left Egypt, but I think it also reflects multiple layers of how women, modern and ancient women, are viewed. And we read in Edward Said about Flaubert and how he meets Kushok-Hanem in Esna, but we never hear from Kushok-Hanem her viewpoint. We also have, of course, the late Jan Assmann, although I appreciate very much his scholarship, but he still wrote about idealizing the femininity and the sensuality of Nefertiti. And it is this continued androcentrism that went hand in hand with colonialism, this obsession by Western males with these strong women, but they could not see them as strong women, but as this perfect beauty and sensuality. Of course, we know that Nefertiti wore the Nubian wig of war. She also sometimes wore the khat. Of course, other strong women. We also have early writings of Egyptian women, such as Nabawiya Musa, who wrote the first play theater called Nub Hotep, about how strong ancient Egyptians women were. And you see this also still in museum displays. This is the mummy of Shepin Isis, a 26th dynasty priestess from Luxor, who's shown half naked at a library abbey in St. Gallen in Switzerland. Very, very highly sexualized, very indecent, and is shown just as an object, not as a human being. Of course, this continues the hype of the spectacularization of wanting to show the screen, the gold, the discoveries, the secrets. And this continues hurting Egyptology because knowledge is more precious than the gold. And this is what needs, the narrative that needs to be changed. And of course, I like this graffiti very much of Nefertiti wearing the gas mask, not the Nefertiti who is a hostage in a glass box that's bulletproof in a Berlin museum, because this is how Nefertiti should be as part of Egyptian women movement on the street, engaging with modern Egypt rather than just being in a glass box. And you can see here how Egyptians actually used ancient Egyptian art as part of social movements. So what the point I try to make is it's not about the restitution of the Rosetta Stone or the bust of Nefertiti, but it's about the restitution of the agency to create knowledge about our past. It's not just about the objects of Tutankhamun, but about the archive through which we can write knowledge and write our own past. And as Antonio Gramsci has said, that the task is to compile an inventory of the traces that history has left in us. And let me also finish with another beautiful graffiti that used to be in downtown, which said that when I first opened my eyes, and before my mother knew me, they applied kohl in my eyes, reaching to my temples, so I can look like your statues. And I thank you very much for this wonderful talk and would be happy to engage with your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Monica Hanna. What a brilliant lecture, and yeah, I think really thought-provoking. I think it's really highlighted the importance of rethinking about the past and the colonial histories where Egyptology grew from. But yeah, thinking of those things very critically, and how we can move forward and improve the field of Egyptology more widely, but how that really requires all of us to be open and involved in that conversation. So yeah, thank you so much for presenting for the Egypt Exploration.
Thank you. Happy to do that.
Thank you. So
thanks for having me.
we're honored. Well, thank you. And I'll just show the book again. There we go. So please do get your copy from Diwan Publishing. I've popped a link in the chat in Zoom,
Thank you.
or it will be available on the YouTube channel. So please do
Thank you.
go and buy a copy to learn even more about the subject. And we will be accessioning this copy into the EES library very soon.
Yay.
So it will also be available there.
I'll send the second copy for the library in Cairo. So you can have one in Cairo and one in London.
Shukran. So yeah, I think that's all that's left for me to say is a huge thank you to Monica Hanna for
Thank you for
presenting.
having me. It's been a true pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, and definitely a topic that we all need to dive into further and explore in our own way. So thank you for opening the discussion with the EES today. And
Agreed.
thank you all for joining us, and hopefully we will see you at another EES event soon. Thank you again, Monica, and thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.